you would turn with me to Matthew chapter 14, and we will spend the entirety of our evening in Matthew chapter 14, looking at verses 22 through 33, and looking at the time where Jesus not only taught his disciples a powerful lesson, but look at a time where Jesus was taking care of his disciples, looking at a time where Jesus was spending his time in prayer, and then finally looking at a time where Jesus showed not only the world of which we live in, but the world of which he stood in, who he was, and what he truly was capable of. You see, we often look at Matthew chapter 14 and go down to verse 22, and we look at Peter. And we see Peter who was willing to say, "It's the Lord." And we see Peter who was willing to say, "Let me come to you." And we oftentimes look at Peter who was sinking. And that's all we take from the account. We see him walking on water and losing his sight because of the boisterous wind, the calamity that had revolved around him. But I want us tonight to look at a deeper look at this particular account and see some things that maybe we've not seen before as we walk through these verses together. They're just short. What I want us to do is look at the account. Let's see what was taking place. Let's see what happened. And the way I want to do that is going to be something unusual and something I usually do not do in a sermon, but tonight we're going to do that because I think it'll help us in the account. And then in the lessons, I want us to look at 12 different things that happened in this account, and things that will help us and help us grow in our faith to be more like Peter, who is willing to step out, but even deeper than that, to be more like those who follow after Jesus in a deeper way, who never take their eye off him, no matter what's taking place in the world that surrounds us. So what I want you to do with me is go to Matthew chapter 14, and I want you to read with me, just read with me, the account. We're going to pick up in verse 22, and we're going to read down to verse 23. And that will set the stage for our discussion as we go through together. And it begins this way in verse 22. It reads this way: "And straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship, and to go before him unto the other side, and he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent the multitude away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea, tossed with the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, It is a spirit. And they cried out for fear. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me to come unto thee on the water. And he said, Come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him, and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore did thou doubt? And when they were come into the ship, the wind ceased, and they that were in the ship came and worshipped him, saying, Of a truth, thou art the Son of God. I chose specifically to do that for a reason. Sometimes we're so quick to make comments about a passage. We're so quick to read a passage and have something to say about it. I wanted you and I just to have a moment to where we opened an account where Jesus was alive, to where the disciples were there, and to where something was happening of which you and I can relate to some degree, and just see what it had to say. And here's what we noticed. We noticed Jesus, who was concerned about his disciples. Didn't you see that as it began? And he sent them away, but here's what I want you to see. Jesus took the time to pray. Did you notice that in the beginning of this? He took the time to pray alone. And then Jesus does something that is rather unexpected for you and I. That's something I haven't seen. Is it something that you've seen? I've never seen someone walking on the sea. I've never seen someone walking on water. I've seen people walking in water, but not on it. I've never seen someone in the morning coming to you in the light of the day and you did not know who he was. But you and I have been fearful before, like the disciples were fearful. And hopefully we've had the faith that Peter had to say, if it's you, Lord, bid me to come. I think we've all been like Peter, haven't we? In moments that we've seen in our lives of what seemed to be great moments of faith, we found our own weakness, didn't we? And hopefully we were like the rest of the disciples and those that were on the ship of who truly can survey the evidence and see who Jesus really was. It has nothing to do with this particular thing that we're studying tonight, but you and I need to take the time to have a deeper understanding of who Jesus was. To know more about Jesus than to know that he just went to the cross, because it was much deeper than that. To know where he came from. To know what he endured in this life. You and I know what we've endured in this life. To know who his friends were and his enemies were. To see his family. And to see his ministry. I hope one day you'll take the time to study the ministry of Jesus. And to see what he did in the midst of multitudes, of which we're looking at tonight. He was in the midst of a multitude and he was still taking care of others, even though he needed to take care of himself in the physical. And to get a deeper understanding of who Jesus was. Because who Jesus was caused people to walk on water. It caused people to leave everything they've ever known and to serve him. It caused people to go to their deaths. And sometimes I believe that we barely scratch the surface in our lives of who Jesus really is. We know that he's important. We know that we need him. But do we really know who Jesus was in the way of which Peter may have known, or the others who were called disciples may have known? But you see inside of the account that Jesus was involved in their lives. He was in their lives, and they were in his. So you look at the account. It's very simple. Let's look at the lessons. There are 12 lessons that I believe we see in this account that will help our faith. Here's the first. Pick up with me in verse 22. Inside of Matthew 14:22, you notice something that's very important about who Jesus is. You notice that Jesus is always concerned about his disciples. This was not the first time that Jesus had sent his disciples away. This was not the last time that Jesus was going to be concerned about his disciples. If you pick up in verse 22, Jesus commanded his disciples to get into the ship and go before him unto the other side while he sent the multitude away. I don't know if you've ever seen a multitude of people, but I believe it's more than what we see on a daily basis, isn't it? A large amount of people who are concerned about who Jesus was and are concerned about who the disciples were. Imagine being the disciples for just a moment and dealing with all the chaos that could have been, all the work that would have been to see a multitude of people who want to know who Jesus is. How would you react if that was the case? But after all of this was over with the multitude, Jesus knows that his disciples need a moment. You ever needed a moment? I think we all have needed a moment before. So Jesus sends his disciples away. And here's what I want you to see. The disciples were learners. They were students of Jesus. But Jesus always took care of them. I find that impressive to know. And I think if we're going to deepen our faith about who Jesus is, we need to know that Jesus is always concerned about those that are following him, about those who are wanting to be like him, about those who are discipling their lives after him. Lesson number 1, Jesus is always concerned about you. Lesson number 2 comes in the form of Matthew chapter 14, verse 23. And you see that Jesus is always concerned about his prayer life. It's in verse 23 you learn this. Verse 23, and when he sent the multitude away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. I was reading this recently and thought of this particular question. When do you pray alone? I can imagine the multitudes. I can imagine the needs of the disciples. But what was the need of Jesus? Jesus, who felt all the areas of our lives, he felt pain, he felt emotion, he felt hunger, he felt tiredness. I imagine the day was quite pressing upon him. And what did he do when things were rather chaotic? After he took care of those of which were his disciples, he sends the multitudes away. What does Jesus do? He takes the time to pray alone. When is the last time that you prayed alone? That's something you'll have to answer and I'll have to answer. But think about this for just a moment. Our prayers here at this place, they're different than our personal prayers, aren't they? They're different in the fact that when we come together in this place and when we assemble together in this place, we're being led in prayer. And those can be sometimes generic prayers, sometimes very specific prayers, but they're not always the things that you and I pray about in private, are they? I think you will understand that there is a difference in our personal prayer life and in our public prayer life, such as tonight. Say if we were to pray right now, we would all have different things that we were to pray about. And I love the idea about Jesus here. He takes care of his disciples, but he was concerned about his prayer life. And that drives a point to you and me, I think. If Jesus was concerned about prayer, shouldn't we be concerned about prayer? That's number 2. Go with me into verse 24 and see lesson number 3 from this particular account where Peter walked upon the sea. And here it is in verse 24. They were in the ship. It was in the midst of the sea. Look at the last part of the verse. Tossed with waves, for the wind was contrary. You know, life is not always filled with the things that we desire. I don't think there's a person in this room, I don't believe there's a person in this world that would choose to have a bad day. Any takers? Does anyone want tomorrow to be a bad day? Does anyone want tomorrow to be a terrible day? But sometimes it is. Joe's going to have surgery tomorrow. Maybe that's a bad day. But sometimes life throws us things that, well, we just weren't expecting. And I can't imagine that these disciples, after they had been in the presence of Jesus, helping him with the multitudes of people, and Jesus sends them away, that they expected to be in the midst of the sea, tossed by a contrary wind. The word contrary here in Matthew 14:24 is a word that means against you. It was against them. And does it not sometimes feel like life is against you? Because the truth is, life is not always filled with the things that we may desire. And sometimes the idea is things are against us. There's something that we know. And we're going to see that in tonight's lesson. The Lord was not very far away from them, was he? And we'll see that in just a minute. But life is not always the way we would have it to be. As you roll into verse 25, you recognize that God is not that far away from them, and neither is he that far away from our lives. Verse 25, in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. Sometimes I believe we get to verse 25 and we get amazed at what Jesus was able to do, and we should be. We should be amazed with everything that Jesus was able to do. I encourage you, the next time you have the opportunity, try to walk on water. And report back to me how that goes. I don't think you'll walk, will you? We can sink in water. We can swim in water. We can walk in water, but never on water. And sometimes when we get to Matthew 14:25, we're so enamored by what Jesus did that we miss what was taking place. It was Jesus who was not very far away from his disciples. Have you ever wondered why Jesus was walking upon the sea? The text does not indicate to you and I why he was doing that. But could it not be that he knew his disciples were in fear? We learn in the account that they were fearful because of what they saw of him walking on them. We know that in many other occasions they were concerned about being in a ship on water in the same type conditions. Could it not be that Jesus was coming to calm their lives? Acts chapter 17, verse 27 tells us that God is not very far away from any of us. Does that not calm you, at least to a degree? I know that in the midst of chaos, it's hard to think that God is not that far away from us. But here were the disciples, and here is Jesus. And what is Jesus concerned about? He's concerned about them. I believe verse 25 tells us a very great lesson about who Jesus is and about what Jesus is concerned about. It's His people, isn't it? Our Lord is concerned about His people. And thus He comes walking on the sea to find those of which are in trouble. And the truth is, God is not very far from us, verse 25. In verse 26, we learn our next lesson. Sometimes I believe we get to verse 26 and we can't sympathize. We have a hard time understanding. It was very early in the morning as this ship was being tossed to and fro, 3 to 6 a.m. in that fourth watch of the night. And the disciples were troubled. I don't know what you would think, but if it was at this time of the day, if you were in the midst of a storm of which was tossed very to and fro by the wind, if you really couldn't see what was coming at you and you saw something coming at you, would you be very happy or would you be afraid? I think it's natural, verse 26, the disciples. When the disciples saw Him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It's a spirit," and they cried out for fear. What would you do? I don't know what I would do, just as much as I don't think you know what you would do. But they were concerned, weren't they? It was enough so that they cried out aloud. Have you ever screamed? Every now and then, this is kind of funny to me. It may not be funny to you because it might be you, but I'll walk through the building and stumble upon somebody by accident. And guess what happens from time to time? They'll scream because they didn't hear me and I didn't hear them, and before I knew it, there we were. Have you ever screamed like that? That moment of fear where you did not know what was going to take place? Well, that was the disciples here. And think about their occasion for just a moment. It was not that they were in a building of which they could run. They were in a boat and they couldn't walk on the sea. And here comes something walking on the water in the midst of a contrary storm that was against them. It seems in verse 26 that they relied on the ways of the world. It's a spirit, they said. And they cried out in fear. You know, we usually go to extremes, don't you? I think we do that. Have you ever been alone at your home and you heard a strange noise? What was the first thing in your mind? The furthest thing from reality. We usually go to extremes too. And that's what they did here. They didn't know what it was. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know who it was, but they certainly knew something was coming. So they thought to the furthest extreme, and sometimes we're just like them. It's verse 27, of which I think is the key text of this particular occasion. Of all the things that takes place in this chapter, I believe this is the most important. It's the voice of the Lord. But straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I, be not afraid." I believe the voice of Jesus is always the calming force in this life. What does Jesus offer for just a minute? Well, Jesus offers life, doesn't He? Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth, and life. No man cometh to the Father but by me." Jesus offers salvation. Jesus offers eternity. Just consider for just a moment, does Jesus offer this world anything that is against them? The answer is no. And I love what's happening in verse 27. And it plays into the idea of what we've already kind of discovered in the account, that Jesus knew that they were in fear because He says, "Be of good cheer. It is I, be not afraid." It's told of sheep that they know the voice of their shepherd. They learn the voice, they know the voice, and they know no other voice other than their shepherd. And it's a calming voice. Isn't Jesus the chief shepherd of our lives? I can only imagine, because we're not in the occasion, verse 27, that they knew the voice of Jesus. I know the voice of my children. They're both distinct, and I can pick them out of the crowd. I know the voice of my wife. It is distinct, and I can pick it out of the crowd. And I'm sure the disciples knew the voice of Jesus, and it was distinct to them. Imagine how calming it was. But here's the question in regard to hearing. Who do we listen to when we are afraid? Who do we listen to when we're afraid? Far too many times, I believe, we listen to the world. Maybe we listen to the news. Maybe we listen to our friends. Maybe we listen to our family way before we listen to the Lord. Who could have calmed the disciples but Jesus? The answer is it was no one that could have calmed Jesus or calmed the disciples but Jesus. And you and I need to be like them, and we need to listen to the Lord. And by the way, hasn't He given us something to listen to if we're willing to open our ears? Point number next comes in verse 28 as we walk through the passage. It's Peter here in verse 28 who answered and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me to come to thee on the water. Sometimes I read verse 28 and wonder, what was Peter thinking? What if it wasn't him? Well, I guess he would have sank. But it was him. See, you and I already know who it is. We already know that Jesus sent them away in the boat. We already know that Jesus spent time in prayer. We already know that Jesus was walking on the sea far before they ever saw him. But Peter doesn't know that. And Peter showed his faith in Jesus by knowing him. Now that should read knowing him instead of not knowing who him. By knowing him. Here's the idea, and I've posed it in this idea of faith. Would you walk on the water? Now, Jesus is not calling you to walk on water, but He is calling you to walk by faith and to walk by sight, isn't He? Jesus is calling you to walk as the Christian should. Jesus is calling you to worship as the Christian should. Jesus is calling you and I to do a number of things. Will we do them? Now, what we're going to see about Peter, and maybe this is a great quality that you and I need more that Peter has, is all the Lord has to do is say one word in verse 29. Come. Come. And Peter steps out of a boat onto a substance of which should allow him to sink, but he doesn't. It's a lesson of faith that Peter shows inside of Jesus. And it's Peter who listens to Jesus and focused on his moment upon him. Verse 29, he said, come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. I don't know how far he walked. I don't know how long he was on the water. You don't either. But here's what I know. The Lord said, come. And Peter stepped out on water. And Peter walked on water. And as far as I know, Jesus and Peter are the only two people who ever walked on water. That's impressive. All with this word, come. It's because Peter knew the voice of Jesus. It's because Peter knew who Jesus was. It's because Peter had a focus inside of his life. Now, you and I know that Peter's going to lose his focus. See, for us, we already know the end of the story before we ever began it. How many times have you studied about Peter who walked on the water and Peter who sank and about Jesus who came to them in the third or the fourth watch of the night? Quite often, isn't it? But we often lose our focus inside of this life as well, and that brings us into verse 30. It was Peter, but when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried, Lord, save me. I believe you and I are like Peter a lot. Peter has foot and mouth disease. Peter has bad location disease. Peter has strange thought disease. But many times Peter has great faith. And in the midst of all of this that was taking place, he's standing on water. He's walking to the Lord of which he knows his voice. And what does he do? He does what you and I do so often. He looked around. He looked around. What happens when you look around? You see, when you look around, you're no longer focusing on what's important, are you? And Peter, who was focused on Jesus with his voice and words, with his eyes to walk to him, he looked around. And sometimes we do that. We look around to the world to see what the world is doing, and we try to justify what the world is doing so that we can be like the world. We look around to the religious world, and we look to see what the religious world is doing, even our own brethren sometimes. And we look to see what they're doing to justify these things in our lives. And what happens when we look around? We, like Peter, sink. But we can say this good about Peter. Peter knew who could help him in that moment. Now, I'm not telling you that the next time you're sinking in water, you can plead to the Lord to save you. But in this occasion, Peter could. And Peter turned to the only one of which could help him. Will we do that in our lives when we look away? Will we turn back to the Lord when we've wandered away from Him? When we begin to sink in the problems of this world? When we recognize the condition that we're in? That's what what happened to Peter. It's about his sight. Though he had lost his sight by looking around, he knew where he needed to go, and that was back to the Lord in verse 30. In verse 31, you see Jesus who stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherefore did thou doubt? Verse 31 proves something to you and I. With all of our failures, with all of our problems, Jesus is always there in a time of trouble. There are many occasions that prove that to you and I. Number one, does the cross not prove that to you? The cross should be the ultimate form of this, shouldn't it? When mankind was in trouble, the problem of sin, what did Jesus do? Knowing that He could have walked away, what did Jesus do? He went to the cross, didn't He? And over inside of the ministry of Jesus, what did Jesus teach about how the lost who are in Christ can come home? And how those who are lost in this world can come to the Lord? Where else could Peter go? It seems evident, verse 31, that Peter was far enough from the ship that they couldn't help him. I don't know how far he was away. But it seems that he was far enough away that they could not help him. That tells us something about our lives. We should be concerned about our proximity to the Lord and how far away we get from Him and from the Lord's people. But here's something that kind of hit me in the thought. When Jesus extended His hand and when Jesus extended the hand of rebuke to Peter by what He said, did that embarrass Peter? Would it embarrass you if the Lord asked you why you had such little faith in front of everybody else? I think the answer is yes. It would me. I don't care to admit that. Now, there's a reason I ask that. We live in a don't embarrass me culture. We live in a culture that's anti-embarrassment. Now, I'm not saying we need to go try to find ways in which we can embarrass people. But Peter took his eyes off the Lord. And the Lord calls it what it is. He says, why did you lack in faith? Here's a question for you and I. Why do we lack in faith? And sometimes we need to be asked the same question as Peter was asked, because he was going for the hand of the Lord. And this verse 32, when they were coming to the ship, the winds ceased. You know, there's something we learn about Jesus. even though he was at the midst of great controversy in the most of his ministry. Even though he was in the midst of great problems in his ministry, Jesus is always the center of calm, no matter the winds. When the Pharisees and Sadducees came at Jesus, what happened to Jesus? He remained calm, did he not? When the religious leaders of the day, the people of which his lineage came from, in this physical sense, when they came for his life, what did he do? He remained calm. In the midst of Pilate and the other accusers of which put him on trial, what did Jesus do? He remained calm. When he told his disciples that one of them was going to betray him, what did he do? He remained calm. When he told Peter that you'll deny me 3 times, what did he do? He remained calm. No matter the storm, no matter the winds, no matter the problem, Jesus was always calm. This moment is very calm right now, isn't it? But what if it were not? What if it were filled with chaos? Would we know to whom we can go where all things can be made calm? Here's the idea. Those winds that were so bad, in the presence of the Lord, they were forgotten. They didn't talk about these winds, and you'll notice this in just a minute in verse 33. They didn't talk about the winds anymore. They were so afraid of the winds, they were so afraid of the problems that were at hand until Jesus was there, was everything made calm. And you and I don't talk about the fact very often that the winds were made calm here. We're so enamored by Jesus walking on the water. We're so enamored by Jesus asking Peter about his lack of faith, and we're going to roll into a verse where the people evaluate the evidence of who Jesus is. But here's something true, something that's true. Jesus is the center of all things that are calm. And then finally, verse 33. Then they that were in the ship came and worshiped him, saying, Of a truth, thou art the Son of God. You and I need to be more like these men. I can almost imagine this, can't you? And I want you to do this for just a moment. Try to put yourself in the position of one who saw all this happen, who saw the disciples being taken care of by Jesus and put on this ship, who saw this one walking upon the water not knowing what it was, who saw Peter asking, Lord, if it be you, bid me to come on the water, who saw Peter walking out on the water and walked for some time. We don't know how far. They knew. Who saw Peter beginning to sink, and who saw Peter begging the Lord to save him, and who saw the Lord save Peter. And who saw that when Jesus was in the boat, the calming effect of which he had. What would you say about this man that was called Jesus? After you surveyed all the evidence that was right in front of you, what would you say about Jesus? Well, anybody could have done that. Well, he just got lucky. That's not what these men said, is it? I love one of the words they use in verse 33. Of a truth. They looked at all the evidence, everything that they could see, and they could declare by what they understood and what they knew who this man named Jesus was. Here's what they said. Thou art the Son of God. It's a very bold statement to make about someone, isn't it? But they made it about this one that's called Jesus, who walked on the water, who calmed the storm, who saved a man who was on the water, and who bid the man to come. You see, the evidence was viewed and a decision was reached. Here's what I recognize. They knew who Jesus was. They just didn't know about him. I think many times you and I fall guilty of just knowing about Jesus. They didn't just know of him. I think many times you and I fall guilty of just knowing who he is. But they knew exactly what he was capable of. They knew exactly what he had done right before them. They knew exactly how He was different than anything else that had been in this world. They knew the Lord. And here's my final question for you. It comes out of verse 33. Do you know the Lord? I mean, do you really know who the Lord is? Do you really know what He's capable of? Do you really know what He has done? And when we can answer that, we can say that we know who the Lord is. And I think we can better say what the Lord has done. Now, in this occasion, in the book of Matthew, you learn about Peter, who for just a moment he looked away. You learn about Jesus, who was concerned about the multitudes, who was concerned about His disciples. And you learn about those other men that were in the boat. And you see how they were able to look at everything that took place and made a determination of who Jesus was. Well, tonight I don't want you to make a determination about who Jesus is. Even though the evidence can be placed right before you in your life, I want you to make a determination, and I want myself to make a determination of who we are. Who are you tonight? And there's two ways I want you to look at that question of who are you, and I'll ask the question of me, who am I? Are you going to heaven? Or are you not sure? Let's answer the first. Are you going to heaven? You answer that in your mind. If the answer is yes, then keep living the Christian life. Keep learning about the Lord and continue to grow in your faith. But if the answer is no, then you have a decision to make. Maybe tonight you've never become a child of God. You can do that tonight. We can study with you about that. Maybe you are a child of God and you know there are things in your life that need to be made right. You have to make that determination. I can't do that for you. But you'll have to do that. Why not make it right tonight? Why not take that first great leap out of the pew, not out of the boat, out of the pew, to make your life right with the Lord? Become a child of God or make your life right. That's the first question. Are you going to heaven? Answer yes or no. The second was, I don't know. Sometimes I don't think we rationalize in our minds what it really means to not know about eternity. Here's something that's true. Eternity is coming. Here's another fact that's true. We're all marching toward eternity. And here's something else that's true. We have tonight to figure it out. If you answered, I don't know, to am I going to heaven, then figure it out. But here's something you need to do. You can't listen to my words alone to figure it out. You must listen to the Lord. Do you remember when Peter said, Lord, if it be you, bid me to come on the water? And the Lord said, come. What did Peter do? He stepped out of the boat. Well, the Bible tells you and I that we can come to the Lord. He's not asking us to step out of the boat, but He's asking us to live the life and dedicate ourselves to Him. And maybe that's what you need to do tonight, is look deeper into His Word. Maybe you don't know where you're going to go when eternity comes. Well, maybe a good Bible study would do you some well and make you feel better and help you understand what you must do to be saved. That's a great question of Scripture. Dennis has picked out a song for us. Let's sing that song. Let's determine where we're going to spend eternity. And let's take that step that we need to take tonight to be with the Lord. Let's stand and sing and respond accordingly.